On this podcast, I usually have some interesting preamble at the top of an episode where I dig into something related to the topic of the feature conversation. But this month's episode is on moral and political divisions, and I feel like all I have to do is just point to the world around me in the United States, just like all this stuff. It seems like we're in as tense a place as you can get, where a lot of us are seeing long-standing American institutions crumble, with darker days looming. But then I guess there are plenty of people who are cheering on the erosion of these institutions and the values they reflect. And I try to remember that there seemed to be people who saw the Biden era in the same way, but it can be really difficult not to say, sure, but this one feels different. And listen, this is a giant problem, and one that a few psychologists aren't going to solve all on their own. But you know what? This is a social science podcast, so let's look at the social science. If you've been listening to this show for any length of time, you'll know that this political fracturing has been going on for a while. We've looked at public opinion data showing that liberals and conservatives increasingly dislike one another, and considering ways that we might mend these divisions, whether it's through more productive conversations, like episode 82 with Taylor Carlson, or episode 85 with Monica Guzman, better social media algorithms, like in episode 92 with Andy Guess, or any number of kooky strategies, like in episode 64 with Rob Willer. But there's another part of the conundrum, which is why people are so ready to fall into outrage. What's actually happening when our sense of right and wrong is threatened? Well, wouldn't you know, that's the subject of a new book, Outrage, Why We Fight About Morality and Politics and How to Find Common Ground, written by Kurt Gray, who you're about to hear from. Kurt is a professor of psychology at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, although he's about to head my direction starting this fall at Ohio State. Kurt runs the Deepest Beliefs Lab and the Center for the Science of Moral Understanding. He's done a lot of work unpacking what morality even is and how we navigate moral disagreements. As a quick setup, Kurt and I will talk about how his view of morality differs from moral foundations theory, which you may have heard about, maybe even on this show. Episode 47 with Jesse Graham and episode 81 with Morteza Deghani are both good listens for moral foundations talk. I'm doing a lot of references to previous episodes, but it's almost like there's a theme to this show or something. Anyhow, very, very briefly, and skipping over plenty of nuance, moral foundations theory is notable for its quality of moral pluralism, which argues that our sense of moral right and wrong comes down to several qualitatively unique values that can't be boiled down any more simply. Most often, these values are care, fairness, loyalty, authority, and purity. 5 values that they argue are not interchangeable, each of which being just as plausible a foundation for a person's moral judgments. Kurt and his team have argued instead for moral monism, that there's just one thing that ultimately matters for people's moral judgments, whether or not some agent, like a person, intentionally causes harm. That's it. Harm or bust. Those other things, like disloyalty or impurity, only pinch a moral nerve if it feels like there's harm involved. At least that's the simple version. I go into all of that because it's a lot of what we'll end up talking about, so now you're armed with the basics. But enough of me. Let's get into my conversation with Kurt Gray. My curiosity was like, why write this? And particularly why write it now, right? You've been doing this work for a while. It seems like you could have reasonably written this book years ago. What was it that like finally made you go like, this is something I'd like to do? It seems like now is the time.
Well, I wrote the book now, I think for a couple reasons. One, obviously the political moment is especially contentious. People are especially outraged, social media and so forth. But also, I think scientifically, I wrote the book because my research was kind of at a kind of special point, I think. And so I've been arguing for the past decade that, you know, all our moral judgments revolve around harm. Got a lot of evidence on that. Got a lot of evidence that the idea of moral foundations theory is pretty shaky. But it's not enough just to say that, like, look, we're all the same, because clearly we're, filled with disagreement, and there's clearly, moral diversity and pluralism. And so, like, how can you reconcile this kind of harm-based mind that I argue for with moral differences that are so obvious. And so I started doing some research on kind of how different assumptions of vulnerability, assumptions about who or what is especially vulnerable to harm, how those give rise to kind of differences in moral judgments. And once I kind of discovered that, then it made sense to write the book, because not only do we have this like, look, we have this common moral mind, but also it can give rise to differences in a fairly simple and powerful way. And I think that explains a lot of hot button issues. So happy to go into that, but that's why now, because the research kind of did both similarities and differences.
And if you're to sort of paint a picture, I mean, the book covers a lot of ground, as we mentioned just a minute ago, but what is sort of like, if you were to say like, this is the main thing that you would get from this book, like what's your sell to the world about what your point ultimately is?
Yeah, I mean, really, it's about understanding why we disagree when it comes to morality, right? I mean, I think self-knowledge, as a psychologist, and maybe someone who's like a little more introspective as well, I just think like self-knowledge is really useful. Like, how do I work? And how people work dictates like how we can act in the world, right? Like, you can't do something that we're like not capable of, or it's really hard. And so if you understand kind of who we are as a species and a society, then you can kind of both understand why we're disagreeing and like meet people where they're at when you try to find common ground. And so the cell is really kind of knowledge first and foremost, but also like super useful practical knowledge. And not just about politics, right? Like, you're disagreeing with your partner or your parents or your coworkers, right? And like, why are you so morally convicted in your position, and why are they so convicted? Like, what's the argument really about? And it's about harm, right? It's about perceptions of who's the victim, especially if I feel like I'm the victim. And so it's giving us like a common currency, a master key to understand all these moral disagreements. And I think that's super useful. So I think that's the cell.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And your point about like, this is who we are, it gets really fundamental, right? Like, I was really amazed at the amount of work that you would have had to do to paint this like evolutionary portrait of humanity and our like historic struggle on Earth. And so like there was a good bit from that perspective, which I don't suspect is like your primary like maybe your orientation, but like I would not have pegged you as the expert on those things. And so I'm curious, like what sort of work did you have to do to sort of paint that portrait at the outset of the book?
Right. I mean, right. So a lot of reading. And of course, the argument is that we are more prey than we think, and more prey than predator when it comes to early humanity. And we're not talking like 10,000 years ago, we're talking 4 million years ago, kind of as human nature kind of evolved. And as we, refined our psychology, we were constantly in fear of getting eaten or getting attacked. And so all the things that we think of ourselves as natural born predators, I think are not true. Our ability to throw, it's actually not very good. Our ability to run, it's fine, right? But all these cases of like, oh, this helped us evolve for predation, it's like so narrow and so circumstantial. And so a lot of the anthropological evidence that I was not familiar with, I really had to read. And it was super fascinating. And you don't have to dig that much to kind of stumble upon how we were much more prey than predator. There's a book called Man the Hunted, this kind of thick edited volume, all these like chapters, and like people ask us all the time, could you write a chapter for this edited volume? And the answer is almost always like, oh, like no one's going to read this. But this book was so amazing because it was like all these different chapters from all these different academics revolving around the same perspective. And so it was great to learn that. I had a research assistant who helped a lot, who kind of did some scouring, so that took some of the burden off. But it was fascinating to dig into the anthropology for sure.
And what just sort of, we don't have to get into the weeds on it, but like just to, rather than me bring up this stuff and then move right on, like what's the point? Like, why does it matter that our notion of humanity as a predator turns out to be shaky?
Yeah, because the argument is like when we think of when people disagree about morality and like the threats we face politically, right? When we think about the other side, we think of them as predators in a sense, right? They're cold, calculating, they want to burn it all down, they're doing things to harm us, right? That's our narrative. But if you understand that all of us, including people on the other side, are just like trying to do their best to protect themselves, and they're filled with fear as well, And maybe we can argue that like their fears are not as valid as your fears because they're listening to, the wrong news sources or believe in the wrong facts. Fine, we can be more or less deceived. But at the end of the day, everyone's kind of fearing the threats that they fear and they vote accordingly. And so I think that really matters, right? And if you understand that we're all prey, more prey than predator, then you understand like if you're lashing out, if you're being aggressive, even violent, right? It's because you're worried about threats. Like January 6th, I think, very bad, right? No doubt that I think many of those people deserve to go to prison, and killing police is never a cool thing. But I think they were motivated because of like, stop the threats, stop the steal, democracy's failing, right? And so if you understand this kind of psychology, then it makes sense of a lot of people's behaviors and in a more kind of charitable way.
Is the notion, sort of that it's easier to have empathy for fellow prey than for fellow predators?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Like if you're on YouTube and you watch like predation videos, you see like the cat and it's so confident, right? Or, there's like a lion who catches a baby gazelle and it's just kind of batting it or like playing with it just for sport. And I think that's what we think about if we think the other side's predators, right? Just like harming us for sport. But we can certainly empathize more with prey as you're like, fleeing the predators and like, being terrified or like waiting in the darkness, for the animal to, there's like this planet Earth, right? Where there's like some pigs kind of in the dark and the mama pig and the baby pig and the kind of wild cat just comes up and snatches the baby pig and the mom's like, what's going on? I feel like this is more of our psychology, right? You're just like waiting in the darkness for something bad to happen.
Mm-hmm. I was not aware of the predation corner of YouTube, so now I'm happy to know that that's out there for us. Okay, so I want to talk about the harm. I'm sure you've talked about harm-based morality forever, and I don't know that we're going to cover a bunch of new ground, but I do think that it's probably a compelling perspective, particularly for people who have heard other forms of how psychologists think about morality on this show. And we've talked about moral foundations theory before. And so maybe just to set that stage, could you give like just the briefest overview of like what a lot of dominant viewpoints in the psychology of what morality is and how people come to it, and what your alternative take is?
Right. So we can do a brief history lesson, which is that morality used to be grounded in understandings of kind of harm, but objective harms, like questions of like rights and responsibilities. And so I think for decades, morality was about like, well, the right to avoid harm and the right to have certain kind of, freedoms, obviously. And then there was this kind of, in developmental psychology, if you ask kids, like, is it okay to punch your sister? They'll be like, no. Is it okay to wear pajamas? And they're like, well, if the teacher says it's so, right? So they distinguish between like harms and kind of more conventional harm or more conventional wrongs. And then there was some kind of cross-cultural research that found, look, if you go to India, you'll find some people that think that there are things that are wrong beyond kind of obvious physical violence, like eating chicken after a father's funeral. And so this kind of anthropological work made psychology wonder, oh, look, I wonder if there's more bases for our kind of moral judgments than just direct physical or emotional harm. And so that finding and some differences between liberals and conservatives grew into this theory of John Haidt's called moral foundations theory, which is that, our moral minds are divided into little foundations or mechanisms, or the word foundation is like this like deep kind of psychological thing that's like separate, right? Like that word does a lot of lifting in the theory, right? It's not just like moral value. Like many people have said we have different moral values, but the foundation term, I think, does a lot of heavy lifting and maybe in a kind of sneaky way. And so it argues that there's like these 5, used to be 4, used to be 3, now it's 6, but like mostly it's 5 of these foundations. One is kind of physical harm, one is fairness, one is loyalty, one is authority, and one is purity, kind of growing from the kind of roots from the anthropological work in India. And it's argued that these are separate in a deep fundamental way, and that conservatives have all 5 of them, but liberals are kind of stunted and disadvantaged and only have 2, right? So chapter of the book in The Righteous Mind, John Haidt's books, is like there's a conservative advantage when it comes to morality. And so I think, is it true? No. But is it also like dangerous to argue that like one group is more moral than the other? I mean, you can look at the political moment and the rhetoric of like our divide. And I think part of it is because of this rhetoric that like, well, I'm more moral than this side, right? It's not healthy for our democracy. But I think more importantly, as a scientist, like this theory is just it's not true. And it's not true in two ways. One, it's not the case that only conservatives care about things like loyalty and authority and purity. It's just the examples that John used to kind of like try to prove the theory, right? So if I ask you about a hot yoga juice cleanse, you'd be like, that's probably a liberal kind of purity, right? Cleansing the chakras. If I ask you about authority, respecting kind of President Biden or civil rights leaders or union leaders, right? You're like, oh, that's a liberal thing. Or like loyalty to labor solidarity or unions, again, that's a kind of liberal thing. So I think the examples of these values are pretty cherry picked, and it turns out that everyone kind of cares about all these values, and there's scientific work on this as well. But I think the bigger problem is that scientifically, these values are not separate from harm. The reason people care about any of, 5 or 6 or really 100 different values, from like punctuality to industriousness, self-reliance, right? All those things boil down to concerns about harm, right? The reason we need to respect the authority of our parents is because if we don't, right, it's going to cause harm. The reason that we need to have fair elections, which is in fairness, right, is about the kind of harm that's suffered. So all the work that I've done shows that it really revolves around questions of harm, creating this kind of common currency to understand all sorts of moral differences.
Could you give an example of like how, like that, what kind of work shows that? So if you're trying to convince someone particularly that like, no, these all really stem from the same thing, how can we know that that's the case?
Yeah. I mean, the easiest thing to do, like if you put a lot of stock in anthropological work that launched kind of moral psychology, is you can ask people, right? Like it's actually incredibly easy to show that this works. Like if you go to rural India and you ask these Brahmin Indians, like, why is it immoral to eat chicken after your father's funeral? They'll say, well, because it harms my father, right? It's the eldest son's job to process the father's death pollution. And by eating chicken, it stops that. That's the kind of like spiritual understanding of the world. And that causes my father to basically suffer in eternal purgatory forever, right? And so I think if you accept as a psychologist that morality varies and that people will just like tell you their moral judgments, they'll also just tell you their judgments of harm, right? If you ask evangelical Christians about why they're against gay marriage, they'll tell you that they think God's against it, but they'll also tell you that it's going to cause widespread damage to society and to the family, right? So you can just ask people, and moral psychologists have been doing this forever. For some reason, they think it's okay to ask people about morality, but not harm. I don't know why, right? But you can also do lots of kind of social cognition studies, right? So you can put people under time pressure, ask them about whether there's a victim. I mean, we've done some studies where we present people with harmless wrongs, and then they look at the faces of children, and then people perceive those children as suffering more. Like, think of the children if they see those acts as wrong, right? So you indelibly kind of link wrongness to victimhood. And I've got other work that just shows that like victimhood is the feeling is so visceral. It's a lot like morality, right? So Haidt argued for a long time that, look, we should think of morality as this like gut feeling. I think that's true. I think victimhood is a gut feeling too, right? Feelings of harm. Like if you're afraid of flying and you're on a plane and you're like sweating and like looking out the window, and I say like, why are you afraid of flying? And you're like, well, I just feel like it's dangerous. I'm like, well, you know it's not dangerous because here's some statistics. And you're like, fine, I just don't believe them in a visceral level, right? And it's like with harm, like if you're like, I want to have, I tell you, these folks, they're brother and sister, and they have consensual sex together, even though it's totally harmless. You're just like, yeah, I don't believe you, in part because we evolved to like protect ourselves from harm and not believe when someone says something's harmless.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the evidence you have too, that like when you put people under time pressure, they just say it's harmful. Like even if I could explain to myself with every capacity that it's actually probably fine, in that moment, like my gut reaction is about harm. Like it just feels dangerous. Like you're playing with fire there. I have to say too. So one of the things I appreciate about this perspective is it helps define morality in a way that is otherwise hard to do. And so, I have come to moral psychology from the like opinion and communication world. And I have always been, I was just thinking about this last night, if someone were to psychoanalyze me through this podcast, like one of my deals would be, I don't know how to define morality. This comes up constantly on this podcast. And you mentioned edited books doing a real service. The Atlas of Moral Psychology, which you helped edit, like that was what I was like, in this book will be the answer to what morality is. And I definitely learned a lot about moral psychology, but I didn't like get that, like, it still felt like no one's defining it. Everyone's just calling this morality. And I had always wondered, like, these 5 moral foundations, why are these the values that are moral? And the other values that like Schwartz and people have been studying forever, those ones are not the moral ones.
Right.
And so what's helpful about this is, I think your perspective is that if it says something about harm, that is the defining feature of a moral value. Is that how you put it?
If you intuitively see it about harm, right? So I think the point I want to make is that it's not me saying it's harmful, right? People are like, well, you could say anything's harmful, but like, it's not me, right? It's the people's intuitive, visceral sense that something's harmful. Like something breaks the rules and that is causing harm to another vulnerable person. That is what morality is.
So my like provocative proposal is, can we just ditch the word morality? Like, does it serve us to do that? If it's all harm, could we just say, forget it, guys. We're doing the psychology of intuitive and reasoned harm. Does that sit well? Like, would you say, let's do it? Fine.
Well, I think maybe. I think not quite. I think the book, is a little different from the academic work. So the academic work, I think I have a little more of a specific definition. It's a little more complicated, right? So it's not just harm, because this is such a broad word, right? Really, it's a kind of questions of victimization, especially intentional victimization. So we all agree that there's a set of norms, there's a set of rules that we all follow. Some of those norms are arbitrary, right? Like we wear green on St. Patrick's Day, the fork was on the left. And if you did something different, well, it probably wouldn't be immoral. But if you broke a rule and, right, not only it kind of caused harm, but it caused harm to someone vulnerable, and, right, that harm was intentional, like a corporation dumping toxic waste in the water supply that feeds a daycare, you'd be like, well, that's immoral. So I think if we're going to define it, I think it's not just harm because stubbing your toe, whatever, natural disasters, but really this sense that there's like an intentional agent causing suffering. And if you're a philosopher, you're like, well, I can think of lots of things that don't meet that claim. But if you're a philosopher, also like, that's not how the mind works, like philosophy is not psychology. And so there's a continuum of how well things match that definition. And so I'm just saying that like the closer something in the world matches that kind of prototype in our minds of someone intentionally harming a vulnerable victim, the more we think that's immoral. And this is how the funny thing is about this entire theory is it's like, in a sense, so obvious. Like if you know how cognition works, categorization, concepts, and we've known this from like the 70s and 80s, you're like, yeah, of course that's what morality is, right? It's just an instance of categorization. And the template or prototype is this is like victimization. But like for some reason, when you come to morality, this is kind of funny, right? Because you're like, what is morality? It's like, well, what is a cat?
Right.
What is freedom? What is government? What is love? All these things are just like prototypes in the mind given to us by culture and something innate. And like we just kind of match along this prototype. So it's just like any other concept.
And so sort of one way to boil some of this down is that I think your point is that all morality is harm related, but not all harms are morally relevant. Would you agree with that?
That's right. So if you stub your toe, right, that's a harm, but it's maybe not moral. But here's the thing, right? If you stub your toe and you like live with a bunch of other people, you're probably going to be like, oh, my pain, like someone intentionally did this, right? Like someone moved my dresser or like left Lego out and, I'm like pretty pissed off about it. But in general, right, I think all morality kind of revolves around this kind of like understanding of like victimization. But I think victimization too is seen as fundamentally moral. So you kind of draw an equivalence between these ideas. But again, it has to be victimization of someone vulnerable. So if you're like, well, those people over there, they're not vulnerable, like they don't feel like I do, or they like deserved it, right? Like we're punishing them because, they did something wrong. Then it's like normative. And we see them as less vulnerable because we see them as like an evil perpetrator, and that strips them of their vulnerability. So I think it's complicated, but in general, I would define morality as like this kind of perception of a moral dyad, a kind of like victimization unit,
So I'm curious a little bit about your story in this, in terms of like taking on what had become such a normative way of talking about morality. And so, as you describe it now in hindsight, it's like, well, yeah, of course, like what else would it have been? But I'm just curious about like that first moment of insight where you go like, hey, wait a minute, maybe this is all actually the same thing. Do you remember kind of like where the seed of that got planted?
Yeah. These things kind of add up over time. But I wrote a paper in 2010, it was published, on kind of like understandings of kind of how we think about God after suffering. And so after a natural disaster, for instance, what do people do? Well, they don't just say like, well, sometimes the world's random. They're like, well, that was God. He's angry at us for sinning. And I ran this analysis that found that if you look at how much suffering there is in each state, so like disease burden and just basically how terrible it is to live in each state, that's highly correlated with religiosity, with how much people believe in God. And if you control for education, still super high. One of the highest correlations I've found kind of out in the world. And so I argued that like what's happening here is that like, well, if there's suffering, then people perceive an agent, and like God is kind but still intentional, right? But there's like this sense of like, if you see suffering, then you perceive someone to blame for it. Like if I slip on a sidewalk, it's not just to be like, oh, it snowed, they didn't really get a chance to shovel. It's like, well, they intentionally didn't shovel and it's negligent and I'm going to sue them, right? And so the sense of like, well, there's a victim and a perpetrator in our minds, and we apply that situation even when it doesn't really fit. Right? That makes it seem like that's kind of this template that we use to make sense of the world. And if that's a template that we apply on all sorts of things, well, then maybe it applies to harmless wrongs too. Maybe that's how we see all of morality. And so John, I knew of the moral foundations theory. I wasn't against it, but I'm like, oh, I wonder if like people will continue to do this, not from just like the victim to the perpetrator or intentional agent, but the other way too. If you do an act and it seems wrong, maybe people might perceive some suffering there too, right? The other way, I called it dyadic completion. You're completing the dyad from like act to victim. And so I ran some studies on that and it came out, right? People just still see some harm and, I don't know, eating roadkill or consensual incest or all these wild and wonderful things that moral psychologists study. And so I had this data, and I was at the University of Maryland at the time, and John Haidt, who is one of my advisor's best friends, came down to the University of Maryland to give a colloquium, and I was going out to dinner with him. We were in the car, and he says, like, oh, what are you working on? I'm like, oh, I have this like cool thing, because I study mind perception. People like perceive minds and suffering even when it's maybe not objectively there. And people still see some like harm and victimization for these harmless wrongs. And he says, oh, that's super interesting. If that's true, I might have to like amend moral foundations theory a little bit, at the edges of maybe that purity. I'm like, oh, okay, cool. And he's like, oh, that's so interesting. You should suggest me as a reviewer. I'd be excited to see it. I said, okay. And, I'm like a little naive as a new professor. And like, this is one of my advisor's best friends. And so I submit it and I suggest as a reviewer, and he gets the paper and he writes like a 12-page screed about how I'm like wasting my time and his time and moral psychology's time. And like, why would I challenge him? He's already proven beyond the shadow of a doubt that like, it's not about harm. I think he attached his dissertation, I remember, to that review, which I didn't know you could do. There's like a special attachment. He's like, here's my dissertation.
I guess what that's for. I didn't know that's what that box was for.
Yeah, exactly. So it just like, it was really aggressive. I think John is always saying like, look, I'm so like magnanimous in public. I think in private, we sometimes act differently. And I was just kind of floored at the kind of like reaction of this paper. And so it made me think that, like, on one hand, maybe I should give up. But on the other hand, we all know about radicalization. And he was like, well, it's only be true of this, this, and this, and this. So it was kind of like a roadmap of like what I needed to do to show it. And so I think from that study, it was rejected 4 times at every journal in social psychology. And I had a file drawer of 25 studies, but they all worked, Like I had an entire file drawer of like significant studies, but I just had to do, harder and harder tests of this hypothesis. And eventually that's the paper that got published on like, look, we still intuitively perceive harm in all these really like, deep visceral ways from things that are objectively harmful. Or harmless, objectively harmless. And so that's kind of the genesis. And then I, kept on reading. And then if you read the original Moral Foundations theory papers, you're just kind of like, is this the state of the evidence? Like, are we for real? Like, authority and loyalty are correlated 0.9 and they're argued to be separate foundations. Like, in what world would any of this methodological kind of like framework make sense? And so I just think, once you start seeing the kind of weaknesses, the scales fall from your eyes in a sense, and you're just like, it's an entire kind of like edifice built on stories, which we know are powerful, but the data are just very weak and don't match the strength of the claims. So I didn't start out against it, right? But the data just kind of like piled up in this like massive, this massive castle of truth, behind it.
And it's consistent with sort of the frustration I had being like, well, what makes these 5 special? Like, why these 5? And couldn't quite dig up an answer. And it seems like maybe there wasn't one to dig up necessarily. So I think one question that people will have, knowing that like so much of the Moral Foundations work informed political psychology, and it seems like there is this really robust, if you use at least the methods we have available, that there are these political differences in the moral values that people prioritize. And I was thinking of this in terms of, I do some work on moral reframing, and so how do we frame a communication in a way that appeals more to politically liberal or politically conservative folks? And in some ways, it's a little surprising that this literature finds that framing a message in terms of harm makes it particularly appealing to liberals and not so much to conservatives, which doesn't quite fit with like everybody cares about harm. Similarly with like these correlations, like it's true that the notion is that conservatives equally prioritize across these values, but still there's this sense that there's like a correlation between harm values and ideology. So I just wonder how you think about these political divides, which is relevant obviously to the point of the book, with respect to this, like there just seems to be some tension based on the data that people have presented before.
Yeah. I think it's a great point. And, I teach methods and teach philosophy of science. And obviously any theory has to account for all data before it as well, right? So you can't just have a new theory without explaining theory or the data from the past. It's essential. And so I appreciate that question. I think there are many answers. So one, I think that these differences are obviously true in a sense, but they more reflect language and rhetoric than they do reflect deep cognition. And I think this makes sense if you think about where this entire theory came from, right? So Richard Schwader, Haidt's advisor, and Haidt really just adapted Richard's theory and just like applied it to the kind of like, and made it kind of foundational, right? Like made their cognitive mechanisms about it. But Schwader's theory was really about, let's look at conversations and discussions and rhetoric about morality. And then we can just group it into kind of broad categories, right? So you could talk about autonomy, you could talk about community, you could talk about divinity. That's the original kind of foundations, the triad. And these themes weren't separate. You could talk about kind of the harm related from, disobeying divinity. You could talk about how God wants a strong community, right? So there's just like various themes. And so what John did was he kind of took really Schwader's ideas and then applied them to the political divide. And you said, like, well, where do these come from? So what John says in his like Daedalus article is he's like, I just looked around and I just thought, like, what are the issues that conservatives care more about than liberals, right? Like, there's no scientific genesis beyond his intuition, right? And he says, like, look, liberals, they care more about social justice. Conservatives, they seem to care more about like premarital sex and like obeying your pastor. And those are the items that are used to capture the moral foundations theory, right? So it's not that liberals necessarily care about these foundations, right? We're psychologists. We know that everything is all about how you operationalize a construct. So what we know from the science, from lots of science, is that yes, conservatives do care more about premarital sex and religion, and liberals care more about social justice values, right? So I think what I like to say is what's true about moral foundations theory is not new. And what's new is not true, right? What's new is that there are these foundations in the mind that are separate and eternal and innate, right? That's not true. They're not separate. They're highly correlated. What's true, but not new, and we've known for a long time, is like, look, conservatives care more about like obeying pastors and like, you know, your immortal soul and like not having sex until you're married. And so, right. So those are the differences, right? Things we already knew. And what about the reframing literature, or what about the kind of social media analyses? Again, it's just language, right? It's just language. If you use the terms that I use, I'm just going to think that you're part of my group and you're speaking to me, right? And so if I tell you, like, look, I'm really concerned about liberty. I'm like, liberty and freedom and individual freedoms. You'll be like, if you're a libertarian, you'll be like, I like those arguments, you know? But you know what liberals also care about? Individual liberties when it comes to reproductive rights. You know, if I think like a woman should be able to have the personal freedom and liberty to make her decisions, progressives are like, yes. So it's not like one side doesn't care about liberty, or like, you know what's bad? Slavery. Well, you know what liberty is? Freedom from slavery, right? So everyone cares about these ideas, but because we're divided into these communities with separate rhetoric, right? That's what these reframing tap into. And I talked to Rob Willer and he's like, yeah, we never control for that. We never control for rhetoric or communities. And so everything that is moral foundations that is true is just this superficial language and rhetoric, which is interesting, but it doesn't tell us about underlying cognition, right? John Haidt has never run an IET. He's never run, an AMP. He's never done these implicit cognitions. And if you look at implicit cognitions in a moral foundations theory, there's nothing there, right? It's just rhetoric. And so it's funny that John's like, well, harm is just rhetoric. Well, like, it is rhetoric, but it also reflects our deeper cognition. All the other foundations, it's just rhetoric.
All right, before this turns into the moral foundations happy hour, there was one other part, and I appreciate all of this. This has been a really useful discussion, even if this were just a conversation between you and me. I'm finding this super helpful. I also want to talk about, there's another thing in the book that I found interesting that I just wanted to get your take on, which was the notion of concept creep. And so if we think about, like, I just found this a very compelling way of thinking about why these moments of outrage are still so prevalent, despite these like objective metrics of like, we're doing like pretty well, guys, like, but we still just like want to get so mad. And so I wonder if you could just sort of like summarize a little bit that perspective that you present in terms of like whether the real world around us should be setting us up to be so alarmed, and why we are so alarmed despite it.
Yeah. So it's a great question. And I think it's important to say concept creep, because morality and harm is a concept, right? Again, going back to like, well, what is morality? It's a concept in the mind. It's an important one, to be sure, one of the most important in society today. And so there's lots of work on how concepts evolve over time. And what you can find, what's true, is that if you're motivated to detect a concept and that concept becomes less prevalent, then your notion of what counts as that concept expands, it creeps. And that's kind of hard to understand when it's said abstractly. So let's just go to a specific example that I use in the book, food. We're very motivated to find food. There's a physiological like drive, food, right? But right now, food is everywhere. It's abundant, right? You go to a grocery store, it's like a marvelous expanse of food, right? And so if I ask you, standing in the middle of a grocery store, is cat food human food? You say, no, that's stupid. It's called cat food. I'm not going to eat that, right? I'll just like eat a bag of chips. I'll eat a cucumber. I'll eat some like steak, whatever. Great, right? The concept of food, human food, is actually pretty narrow, right? Around things you might eat in a grocery store. Now, let's say food is more scarce. You've been living in the forest for a month, right? Your plane crashed. You're like starving. You're like walking around and you come across, surprisingly, a tin of cat food. Now I say, is this food? And you'd be like, 100% this is human food, right? It's like, I'm going to delight in this delicious melange of like whatever fish heads, and yum, 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 yum. And so the concept of food has crept because it becomes less prevalent, right? And so harm is the same way. We're motivated to find harm because we have these prey-based minds. We're afraid. We're vigilant of threats, right? If you hear like a thumping in your basement at night, you're like, is that a harm, right? Is that a threat? You're walking through a dark alley, you're like, is that a threat? So we're motivated to find threats. But as kind of threats of like actual violence and death become less prevalent, then our idea of what counts as a harm or a threat expands. And so talk about this in the book. I was talking to my mom some time ago. She grew up in northern Canada, northern Ontario, and she's just like kind of casually recounting all the ways that kids would die back then. Just like was like she's almost like smoking a cigarette, like, oh, kids used to die so much. Kids these days, they don't die, like a kid was driving in the back of a car on the highway. There's no child locks or car seats, and this like kid was having a temper tantrum and just opened the door and rolled out and died. We're like, people put candles on their Christmas trees, lit the tree on fire, lit the house on fire. 2 kids died. Kids died in the lake behind the house. Kids died in like trapped in like old fridges. It was just like a lot of kids, so sad, dying. Today, we have seatbelts, we have car seats, we have the Heimlich maneuver. We didn't have the Heimlich maneuver before the 70s, right? Crazy, right? We have all these things that help make us safe. And so because we're safer, right, but we're still terrified of like our, kids being harmed, now we project all sorts of things on the world that seem harmful, right? So a van drives slowly by your kids playing. It's not a lost locksmith. It's a kidnapper, right? Or like your kids are walking a mile to school. You're like, oh, they're going to get abducted. It's terrible, right? So we've expanded our notion of harm. That means we're seeing so many more things as harmful and as immoral. So things like microexpressions, things like, speech as violence. I mean, there's legitimate arguments around all those kind of concerns, but they are probably not concerns that people had back in the Industrial Revolution when kids were losing their hands to machinery, And so I just think it's useful to think of like the scale of like human cognition to make sense of kind of the modern moment.
Do you think that, so there are definitely still people who like roll their eyes at some of these moments of moral outrage? Does it seem like those are people who have more harm in their environment? Like, or call it, I'm trying to think of how to put this, but I don't know if you know what I'm getting at. Like, if someone goes like, you're mad about this like thing that isn't even real when other people have bigger problems. Like, does this notion of concept creep not only explain like a historical arc, but also like an interpersonal dynamic?
Yes, I think so. I think if you've faced kind of like real, right, there's variance. I want to say that. And right, if you suffered substantial physical or emotional harms, then, you might be primed to view things like you might have, PTSD. But the evidence is actually suggests that if you look at kind of individual harms, like it's not a very strong correlation between kind of like suffering harms and kind of seeing these things as harmful more broadly. And I do think that if you like, you suffered through war or you suffer through like real trauma, and you come across someone being like, look, this person gave me like a weird look in the hallway. And liberals and conservatives do this both, right? I've had conservative professors who are like, look, people are giving me dirty looks in the hallway and they're like not inviting me to parties and I need a place to talk about this. And I'm like, yo, conservative professor, it seems like you need a safe space from the microaggressions you're facing, right? So I think, people are people. It's kind of like my feeling in life and in the book too, right? Like everyone has the same kind of moral minds. But I do think that if you have suffered kind of more, you're maybe less focused on these kind of more minor harms. Like I think, with racism as well, to kind of get it on the point of kind of like popular debates, right? Things will happen and there'll kind of be like white folks from more affluent backgrounds who are like, oh, like this is terrible, even like some tears, right? Like this terrible thing happened, or like these people said this. And I think, the black folks I know in the department who have like more suffered kind of like overt, kind of like more aggressive racism are like, yeah, like that sucks. Well, like we keep on working, but like we need to focus on like not eroding these rights of like more kind of like obvious and like, harms. And so there's kind of this, it kind of fits your intuition here too, right? That if you like are actively kind of like being targeted for these harms, you're maybe like less likely to focus on these minor harms because you're experiencing the more major harms. Not to say that it's not important to kind of highlight the kind of like more minor harms that might lead into more, bigger harms, as some have made this argument. But I think it's interesting how these things might come apart.
On the other side too, so this is like, when you're in the midst of harms, like you have a particular view of what that means. And the other side is like from the safety of your observation deck, you have the luxury to find smaller and smaller harms because you need to, right? Like that's kind of the point, is just that like, I can't be safe, right? Like my whole body is telling me I'm not safe, even though I am. And so I like need to find a reason to justify my like intuition that I'm not safe, despite evidence to the contrary. And so I'm curious, like, are you at all optimistic about a utopian future where everyone is perfectly safe and people can just accept it and live it and love it? Or does it seem like we're doomed to outrage?
Yeah, I think the latter. I think, as society's been getting safer for so much longer, it's not that people no longer feel outrage. In fact, perhaps you could argue even more so now. So I don't think there's a place where we're not like bonobos, It's like bonobos will hang out. They'll just have sex all day. It's a matrilineal society, right? Females rule. There's like fruit everywhere. They just like hang out, chill. It's the kind of utopia maybe that we're talking about, right? But we're half chimpanzees too, and chimpanzees live on the other side of the Congo River with gorillas. Food is scarce. They're fighting. There's war. They're constantly kind of like, on guard for predators and for other chimps hurting them. And so I think maybe we're better than chimps, but like we're certainly never going to be bonobos. Like where there's always this threat of fear. And this kind of desire for like even like preventative violence maybe to like safeguard threats that we're worried about. And so I think we have gotten better though, right? Like violence is less than it ever was. That's great. But is there going to be a time where we're all just like, life's great. And like, we're taking our universal payments?
Oh yeah. Universal basic income.
Exactly. Right. We have like UBI and we just like sit and just like sing Kumbaya. Like probably not.
You said at the beginning, though, to end on maybe something more up. I sort of walked us into a pessimistic way to wrap up. So I'm going to turn us around, which is at the beginning, you said that like knowledge is powerful, right? And sort of the point of writing a book like this is to say, like, listen, if we can understand that this is sort of the nature of these disputes, we can maybe grow from it. And so what's your sense? And maybe even just to make it personal, like, are there ways in which you have taken these sorts of lessons to heart and have changed the way that you think or interact with other folks?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, there's a little bit of research is research, like the idea, like people study the things that they don't understand or that they lack, like the deficit theory of, so like if you're socially anxious, you might study like how to be social, things like this. And so maybe I'm like generally low in outrage. I mean, I certainly have moral convictions. I donate to political causes. I vote, but like, it's hard for me to get out. And I feel like the world's pretty safe and I'm kind of an optimist. So maybe I'm a little broken, but I do think, learning about these things has also helped me, right? When I know that like, look, it's much more dangerous in other places, and to think about a kind of broader sense of moral progress, of harms, right? Like the political situation in America today is like not great from many ways. And so if you like zoom out and you think like, well, we had a civil war, and then we had like monarchies, and then we had, like warring city states. And so like, maybe it's just bumps in the road. And like, it doesn't mean I necessarily sleep great at night, but it does help me, to kind of like maybe refocus on work or like what matters with my kids. And it does help me when I interact with everyday people who I disagree with. That's helped me a ton. Like this understanding and knowing how to have conversations with, neighbors, coworkers, Uber drivers who like might think different politically, even in small ways, even in big ways, right? It helps me have those conversations to get less angry and kind of like get the sense that like most of us are in it together and we're trying to make the world a better place. And so like, I'm not surrounded by like threats, like go to Nebraska and I'm just not like, everyone's here wants to kill me, because they don't, right? Everyone here just wants to like get along with their family and their job and just get by. And so I think it helps me not feel threatened by kind of other everyday folks. And that's really useful.
That's the ending I'm looking for. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk about this. The book was a fun read, and I appreciate you taking the time to share it with folks listening to this.
Great. Thanks so much.
Alrighty, that'll do it for another episode of Opinion Science. Thank you again to Kurt Gray for taking the time to talk. His new book is Outrage, Why We Fight About Morality and Politics and How to Find Common Ground, which is out now. You'll find a link to the book and Kurt's website on the episode webpage. And if you think of it, it would be great to rate and review the show on your podcast purveyor of preference. You can also help the show by sending this episode to someone you think would like it, or you could post it on Blue Sky. Help people find the show. I love when we find new ears. Go to opinionsciencepodcast.com for past episodes and other ways to support the podcast. And that's all for me. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next month for more Opinion Science. Bye-bye.